Thank you all for joining us to learn about supporting students' social, emotional, and behavioral growth with effective classroom practice. My name is Brandy, and I'm joined by my friends and colleagues, Maria and Karen and Heather. So each of us will introduce ourselves briefly as we start our sections. But my job is going to be to start us off and provide an overview of some of these critical practices and really have a lot of our attention focused on a new national resource that gives us access to many other resources. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll come back and join you again to share a couple of other national resources. Maria and Karen and Heather are going to tag in to do a slightly deeper dive into the various practices that are discussed and share some critical features. And so we're hoping that you walk away from this session with the opportunity to discuss and think about how to implement and monitor fidelity of implementation for all of these practices that are so critical for students in our classrooms. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to a newer guide that has come out. It's actually a revision of an old guide, so I'll talk about that in a second. It's called Supporting and Responding to Students' Social, Emotional, and Behavioral Needs, and it's a guide that highlights evidence-based practices for educators. So I'll invite you to look at the list of contributors on the left that helped author this revision. And what I'm going to do is just give you a quick tour of what is new since the last version of this guide was released in 2015. So there's a small screenshot of the old guide. And in the new guide, we do an expanded version of kind of what's different. So I'll just highlight a few things. One is that in this new revision, we've thought about expanding our focus to really include an emphasis on students' social, emotional, and behavioral growth. By doing that, we've selected and highlighted a few additional practice areas, including positive connections, thinking about relevant instruction and really forming relationships with our students and among our students, families, and educators. We've talked a little bit more about the link to Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. We've included in this newer revision a more intentional emphasis on staff supports and staff implementation, and we've expanded and updated our list of resources and references. So hopefully you all see, even if you knew the old guide, a lot of new things that draw you into this one. And if you're not familiar with the old guide, you can ignore that part and just dive in. So the purpose of this guide is to highlight those practices that are supported by evidence and that fit with our values around positive and proactive supports. We want to have educators think about in their classroom the capacity to implement the full continuum from Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and to think about those kind of priorities around instruction, promoting equitable outcomes, and thinking about supporting students' social, emotional, and behavioral and academic growth. So we held ourselves accountable to practices that had evidence of being able to do that. We also asked educators to think a little bit about how we can maximize the impact of these practices. So while each of us as educators can do some of this on our own, we know that it's easiest when we're not isolated and we're doing this work as part of an overall framework. So we feel like these practices will be maximized if you're in a school that's implementing a multi-tiered system of support or MTSS framework, such as PBIS, Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. We also think this is maximized when classroom and school-wide systems are linked. So we'll give some examples of what that looks like. And when we're doing this work in the context of our academic instruction, so really thinking about integration and alignment between social, emotional, behavioral, and academic instruction, and always when we use data to drive and guide our decisions. So we gave a little bit more of examples in the guide in this table. I'm going to just invite you to look at that in the guide rather than have me go through that with you. The other piece we wanted to highlight in this guide was how the core features of PBIS show up in the work that we're doing. So we invite you to look at that in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to go through this the fast way because many of you familiar with PBIS have seen this. You may even have it tattooed on a part of your body. So all of the work in PBIS centers equity. So we believe MTSS and the PBIS framework is a mechanism to support and achieve equity for all. We're really clear in this guide that all means all. So thinking about racial and ethnic diversity, thinking about students from different language backgrounds, thinking about students with different ability profiles, and thinking about students with different gender identity, sexual orientation, and every demographic category that I didn't just mention. So we truly mean all means all. And to help us achieve equity, we focus on outcomes. So we think about prioritizing practices, systems, and data that ultimately result in and reflect equitable learning opportunities and achievement and growth for all students. We then prioritize practices that are based on areas of identified need, that are culturally relevant and have evidence to show they're likely to be successful. And we think about how to connect those practices across the domains in the school. We invest in data to help guide our decisions and to think about identifying who needs more, who's benefiting, who's not, and to hold ourselves accountable for adequate progress and for achieving equitable outcomes for all students. And last but certainly not least, we invest in ourselves as educators and as the community. So we think about ways to support ourselves, to support our professional learning and growth, to think about prioritizing wellness, and really set ourselves up for success in these practices. So as we're saying all of that, we're going to take our deepest dive into the practice circle, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what this guide looks like. So the first question is, what's in it? So the guide prioritizes practices that promote growth, that again are consistent with positive and proactive values, that are free, so you will not see packaged curriculum or program in this guide, but that are supported by empirical evidence. So things that are likely to work across populations and across contexts. That still means you need to look at data to make sure it's working in your context, but it is set up for success because we've prioritized those practices that have evidence that they've improved outcomes, that they've decreased challenges, and they've reduced our reliance on reactive or exclusionary discipline practices. What is it not? So the guide is not a replacement for more comprehensive support approaches. So we invite you to read this, but we invite you also to ask for support in coaching and implementation. It is also not a comprehensive guide on tier 2 or tier 3. So while we've tried to show practices across the continuum, there are a lot of other resources, including on PBIS.org, that will talk about really intentional implementation of tier 2 and tier 3. So this guide is, we think, a fantastic foundation, but we would invite you again to ask for additional training, coaching, and support, and not try and go it alone by just reading this guide and working on your own. In the guide, we use a couple of terms that we think are pretty familiar, but we wanted to make sure everyone was using similar language. So there is a quick glossary that defines things like social, emotional, and behavioral competence. We'll use the word context a lot and contextually appropriate or contextually inappropriate behavior. And so those terms and others are defined in the guide. And I want to give you a super quick overview of how it's organized before we get a little bit more into the content. So the guide is organized around 4 key steps to implementation of practices in the classroom. And that's where we are going to take a deep dive in just a couple of minutes. For each and every one of those steps in the guide, they're hyperlinked. So you can click on, for example, step 1.1, and it will pop open a table. In that table is the meat of this resource. So we're going to do kind of the high level overview today, but we'll invite you to go and look at the tables. In the tables, you'll see clearly defined critical features of each practice. You'll see a range of examples of what it looks like in an elementary setting, a range of examples of what it looks like in a middle or high school setting. You'll also see some non-examples, so common mistakes that might be made, and we're trying to prevent ourselves from making those mistakes. And then on the far column is where this guide gives you access to a lot of other resources. So there are relevant and free publications, videos, or podcasts, and other types of resources for each and every practice in this guide. And then while we have said, please get support, don't go it totally alone, we did want to set you up with a way to think about where to start. So it ends with a self-assessment and an opportunity for action planning, and I'll share a little bit more about that when I come back towards the end of this video. So thank you all for staying with us for that overview. And we're going to now dive in as I transition over to Maria, who's going to introduce the first step.
Thank you, Brandy, for that introduction to our content. For everyone, my name is Maria Reina Santiago Rosario. I'm a postdoc at the University of Oregon working for the Center on PBIS. And today I'll go into the first evidence-based strategy that we covered in the Supporting and Responding to Behavior guide, which is creating positive teaching and learning environments for our students and our families and community members. So as part of the creation of that environment for teaching and learning, the first element that's part of it, and we talked about, is the designing of that safe environment. So when we're talking about designing the classroom layout, we're thinking about what are the instructional routines that I use more often, right? How can I gather the space and make it comfortable, smooth for those instructional activities? Or how do I lay out spaces for students to self-regulate if they need to take a pause and calm down somewhere near their desk, but not their study area? So it's thinking about the arrangement of furniture in a way that allows for proximity. So if a group of students might need academic support or might need additional support behaving in expected ways, you as the teacher can get to them quite smoothly without things getting in the way and interrupting that instructional flow. It's ensuring that your instructional materials are orderly, and allows for adequate transitions. It's thinking about accessibility and any unique need that your students may have. And also, how do you use visuals and post these around the room in a way that's supporting critical content for learning, or critical content to remind students of what those classroom expectations are, or what are the steps to important routines in certain spaces of the room. And these pose visuals should be reflective of the diversity in your classroom. So if you're posting positive sayings around your room, who are the folks that have shared these? Are they representative of your students' demographic, of your families, any community leaders that are showcased, any history that's visually posted? It's important to consider within that one. The second element of creating a teaching and learning environment would be to establish that positive connection, building those relationships and maintaining them over time, not just with your students, but also with your families or community members. And we do this through purposeful communication, right? Two-way communication. So how do we embed regular opportunities that create these positive connections? And we can use diverse means of communication like postcards or emails, in addition to newsletters. How do we integrate activities, formal or informal approaches to learn about our students? How do I get to know them? And how, right? How do I get to know them and later and become am able to use that information to integrate into the curricula or the activities for my class, right? How do you build routines that are regular in your school day that allows for those connections to happen with frequency and consistency? So how are you welcoming students into your room? How are you dismissing them? Are there any routines that are building community connection or reflection around current situations that are happening in the school, or to cover or about the academic content that's getting covered in your classroom, right? It's also um, using different strategies to engage families as partner in the learning. So how do we engage them and get them into the classroom in different ways? Do we get communities to come and share with students any particular topic that's unique to their experiences, that's also relevant to what we're learning in the classroom. What are some assignments that allow me to not just know my student better, but also how to know the families and their values and cultures in ways that when I get my students back into the room and have those discussions, I'm able to get that input that was shared between family members, and validating and affirming those personal and cultural learning histories of our students are all part of establishing positive connections. Third one, element to creating positive and teaching environment is developing predictable routines. So thinking of the class schedule, the instructional activities that happen most often, routines that are important for self-regulation in the presence of unexpected events. We want to think of what these routines are, what the steps to the procedures are, and how do we make these clear and explicit to our students. It's teaching those routines and those procedures, maybe using a tool like the classroom matrix, modeling for our students what those behaviors are outside as part of a lesson, but also in real time as natural learning opportunities come up. And how do we reteach these intentionally during natural school breaks or moments in the school year that lend themselves for revisiting routines and procedures. We also want to promote student independence, so we can use visuals, posting the steps to the routines and the areas in which they usually engage in them. We can provide specific feedback that let the student know what they're doing well and how they're going about it so that they can continue that. And of course, allowing that space for self-managed schedule or student guided schedule that gives them more of a voice in the classroom. By defining and teaching positive expectations, right? In thinking of developing predictable routines, we've thought about, what are these and what are the behaviors within these that my students need to be aware of, and what are some of those skills that might be needed so that they can be successful in school. So what are those 3 to 5 positive school expectations, and how do you bring them into your classroom? And if there's no school expectations in your context, how can you co-develop these with your students and make these visually available for reminders? How do you integrate activities like the personal matrix, which is an example covered in the guide, where we get to explore with our students what are expectations across different settings, not just in the school, but also at home and the community. And how do I use that information to understand how many contexts my students navigate, but also rules within my classroom that maybe we can be more flexible with or approach differently after learning from my students and their families. And definitely, wanting to keep it, using the examples and non-examples so that there's multiple opportunities to really explore what these are, receive feedback, and reteach students. And like mentioned before, we want to validate and affirm the behaviors and the expectations that are serving our students outside of the classroom, like in their home and their community. We want to validate and affirm those, and we want to be able to build bridges so they can also see how things can be situational, and in the classroom context things could potentially look different without dismissing the importance of any expectation that your student comes with. into your room. And lastly, the last element is it's planning relevant instruction. So, as mentioned before, in thinking of establishing those routines and getting to know your students and being intentional with the activities that give you information of what your students are passionate about or want to learn more about or feel they can improve, or all this information that you can get from your students by completing surveys or doing a show and tell. you know these are ways to celebrate who your students are, the diversity in your room. That is one way of making instruction relevant. Think about also, what are the social emotional behavioral skills that my student can benefit from learning, and how can I teach this in the curricula that I'm exposing them to, or through the activities that I push them to work with other students in the classroom, where they get to practice these skills of cooperation and collaboration, advocacy, among others, right? Those are elements that we want to be cultivating in our rooms. And also, considering what, like, the dimensions of these activities, how do I differentiate these for the needs of all my learners? So, being aware of that and pre-teaching any prerequisite or alternative that will be placing your student up for success, in a way, right? That's giving them choice, giving them a voice that's heard, um, and helping them be able to communicate what their needs are. So that's all I got to share with you in this overview. And I'm going to pass it on to Karen, who's going to talk to you more about the actively promoting social emotional behavioral growth in the classroom.
Right. Great. Thanks, Maria. I appreciate that. My name is Karen Robbie. I am so excited to be here. My role is to talk a little bit about how we move from the work that's involved in creating our positive teaching and learning environments into actually promoting social emotional behavioral growth in our students. We'll talk about that in a few different ways, and I'll break down how we engage students in relevant learning, how we foster positive relationships, prompt and supervise our SEB, social emotional behavioral skills, and academic skills, and then provide specific feedback as well as a few other considerations. Let's move into how we engage students in relevant learning. The first thing we want to think about is, if we spend all that time, as Maria was talking about, planning our instruction, we want to make sure our students are actually engaging in it and actively involved in it. I invite you to pause and think for a moment about what happens when you're attending a PD session or a meeting or something like that, and where you're expected to sit and listen for a while. I know myself, after about 10 to 15 minutes, I start to check out. If I'm on my laptop, I multitask. If I'm next to colleagues, I start whispering side conversations. Well, our students are going to do the same thing. So as educators, we want to think ahead and be proactive and preventative about that, and plan some opportunities for them to respond to instruction. So think about how when typical procedures where we call on students to answer a question, one student answers at a time. Well, what are the rest of those students doing? I invite people to think about ways to expand our repertoire for response options, and so that we're casting a broader net and getting a larger bang for our buck. A couple of examples might be things like a whip around, where everybody jots down an answer, a 1 or 2 word response, and then the educator goes through and calls on each person to share. Another example might be a stand-up sit down where everybody writes down their responses, everybody stands up, and then the individuals, as they share their response, if others have a similar one, they sit down, so that lots of students are engaged all at once. Of course, you may also want to think about opportunities to use response cards, whiteboards, guided notes, any type of technology that works for you. But the key here is that we're differentiating for students so that we're making sure that all students have opportunities to be engaged as often as possible. Next, let's think about how we take those relationships, or I'm sorry, those connections that Maria talked about developing and fostering those into positive relationships with with adults and students, and with students to students as well. One really great evidence-based practice is to positively greet students at the door. You can find that guide right on pbis.org that walks you through the details of how to do it. But the big idea is that an educator stands at the door as students are walking in. They greet the student by name. They provide some type of a positive connection, and then prompts them to whatever the first activity is, or the expectation for how they'll engage in the classroom that day. When we do this, we see much higher rates of on-task behavior and fewer disruptions as well. But at the very same time, you're building those positive relationships with your students. Another idea is to make sure that you're thinking about ways for students to engage with one another. You've taught those SEB skills. Now we want to give them opportunities to actually practice them. So it might be through some group work activities. It might also be opportunities for more unstructured opportunities, such as recess or class breaks, or how to transitioning in between activities, but give students opportunities to practice those skills, and doing so will also engage them in, or foster that positive community within your classroom. Another big piece to consider is how we utilize students' preferences to engage them in their learning. Think about simple things like using student names, even when you're providing instruction and examples, or if they need to be reading something, that they have opportunities to read about content that's interesting to them. This shows students that you know who they are, and that what they value, and that it's important. And we can do that through both. We can also foster positive relationships through our verbal and nonverbal interactions. You know, a smile or a wink goes a long way, just to let students know that you see them and that they are important to you. All right, prompting and supervising all those skills that we've spent time teaching and reinforcing is also critical. The key here is that a prompt occurs before the opportunity for a behavior actually happens. That may be something as simple as an educator, as they're passing out papers, they remind students how to ask for help, or they remind students about what the voice level, appropriate voice level might be during this work time, but where you're pausing and thinking ahead about what is likely to be a behavior error that may come up, and you prompt it before it even happens. It's also really helpful to have students begin to take ownership over how to prompt themselves. I was just talking with a teacher who has highlighters at right next to the bin where they turn papers in, and students are all expected to grab a highlighter and highlight their name on the top, just before they turn it in, because they were having a really big problem with students turning papers in without names, and it's changed the whole dynamic. As an educator, our job is also to always be monitoring and supervising our students the same way that we would do this for academic instruction. We want to monitor and supervise whether or not students are actually following the routines that we've set up, and demonstrating the skills that we've taught. So those are really important pieces because it helps us to identify then if there are students that need some additional support or if they need extra prompting. The next piece is that as we provide all this instruction and all these opportunities for practice, we need to be sure that we're providing really clear, specific feedback to students to let them know when they're getting it right and when they need some additional support or redirections. So specific feedback here is critical. We also know that through research, the more that teachers provide specific praise, the less students are engaged in disruptive behavior and off-task behavior or other behaviors that we find interrupt learning. So think about ways that you can provide specific praise when you see students doing what you're hoping for. That includes naming what the actual behavior is, making sure that it's sincere, and also matches the student's preferences. An example might be that I might say to Brandy, Brandy, you did a really great job setting us up for this presentation by identifying the outcomes and what we're hoping to achieve here. Well done, right? Sorry to put you on the spot. But we want to be thinking about how we make that really clear so that students don't have to guess what it is that they're doing well. The same goes for corrections. When we are providing a correction, because behavioral errors are going to happen, we want to make sure that we're brief and concise about it. We're doing it in private and also giving students an opportunity to practice doing it the way that we had taught originally. And that we're not drawing a ton of attention and time to it. So keeping it short, quick, and specific is really important. The big key here, though, is that we want to make sure that we have about 5 or more praise statements for every correction that we provide. This is known to be a really key strategy. And for students that are at risk, we want that even higher at a rate of 9 or more specific praise statements for every correction. Not an easy thing to do, and I know that Heather's going to talk a little bit more about how to monitor our own practices and fidelity, but the more that we can provide praise to students, the better. And then the last piece, as we think about ways to promote our students' SEB growth, is to think about how we can adopt some procedures that acknowledge, celebrate, and reinforce when students are using the SEB skills, the academic skills that we have taught them and that we have promoted. Doing so will reinforce the use of them so that it happens more frequently. We can do that through lots of various ways. When you think about classroom acknowledgement systems, such as handing out tickets or notes when you see students doing things well, that they gather together to earn access to a preferred activity, is a perfect example. On the other hand, we also want to always be thinking about how we can prevent or respond to those SEB errors, academic errors that are going to occur. And we can do that by thinking ahead about providing, by looking at the other things that students do and sometimes letting go or ignoring and reinforcing the positive behaviors rather than addressing the ones that are that they're engaging in that are less ideal. All right, I'm going to, pass this off to Heather next, who's going to help us really understand how do we take all of these strategies that both Maria and I talked about and monitor whether or not we're actually doing them as we hope to.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Karen and Maria and Brandy, for giving a great overview so far and for talking about the various practices. And so my name is Heather George, and I'm at the University of South Florida, and I'm going to be talking to you about the last two sections related to how we're recommending you support and respond to students with the social, emotional, behavioral needs. And so we're in step 3 right now of the process about talking about the data aspect of it. And so we're going to talk about not only the data aspect related to the adults that are implementing, but also our students responding to these various interventions that you are engaging in within the classroom. So let's talk about the first thing around the monitoring fidelity, using data to guide implementation. You know, honestly, we need to make sure that whatever we're doing is purposeful, and data can help us determine what we need to be focusing on. But then if we're going to be selecting an intervention, we also need to make sure that that intervention is actually effective and having a positive impact with the students. So data are also another way that can help us with that. So it's really important that whatever we're doing, we're always going back to making sure that it's purposeful, that it's meaningful, and we're determining, and is it making an impact? Because if it's not, we can actually stop and make changes along the way rather than hope for the best and wait for the end of the year. Or unfortunately, things could escalate and get worse. So we really want to respond quickly so that the student has the most likelihood of success. So when we're talking about measuring fidelity, we're talking about measuring, are we implementing the intervention as it was designed, as it was intended? So we're looking at measures that implement like how often we're engaging in the intervention, as well as how well are we implementing that intervention. And also we want to look at, are we equitably using our practices across all of our students? You know, are we only, do we start to see that we're actually only providing pre-corrects or supports for certain groups of students? We need to make sure that we're saying, hey, does everybody have an equitable access to all of these supportive practices within our classroom? Because it is possible if they don't, that could be why we're having some difficulty in the classroom. Also helps to get multiple perspectives. I know as educators, we can get really territorial of our classrooms, really territorial of how we're doing things. But the thing to keep in mind is that we're also a community of practice overall within our school, and we've got to rely on our colleagues to be able to come in and assist us. And at times, even our own students can assist us as well in providing feedback on how well we're doing. It always helps to have another set of eyes at times to come in and give a different perspective, maybe sometimes a more objective perspective, because they may not be as emotionally invested in the lesson plan, emotionally invested or connected with the students in the classroom, and may be able to provide more objective feedback to us. Again, the whole purpose of all of this is another source of data to help us for that continual improvement, so that the student is most likely has an opportunity to succeed. But us as educators, we also can feel that success, experience it, and be proud with everything that we've provided within the classroom. So we also want to look at not only the multiple perspectives, but do we also monitor across time? Because if you were to think about if we chose an intervention and we were to just implement it, say, one time and say, oh, it didn't work, it's really not fair, because one, did we give it enough time to say, could it potentially work? And then two, did we even implement it as it was intended? And did we have multiple people come in, or some people come in occasionally across time to see and provide feedback to us? Because sometimes it's that intervention may work better in the afternoon with that student as opposed to in the morning. So again, multiple sources of data are very, very important in helping us make our decisions. So some things to always think about is when you're looking at the data and helping you guide decisions of what additional supports you need. And again, you're the educator, you may need additional supports, but we're looking at you're needing potentially additional supports in order to best support that student to be successful. So we're looking, you want to look at accessing the resources that you've got, getting explicit training on that particular intervention that's been selected, but then also make sure reach out to your colleagues, and arrange for coaching, ask them for their feedback, what are they observing? Because it can be really, really helpful. It can be helpful if they were to say, I didn't see it that way. And it's like, oh, okay, maybe I have, several days worth of buildup of frustration, and that's getting in the way from me seeing something objectively. But another thing is sometimes they could say, well, I did see this happen that way, and it doesn't look like it's working so well. Well, that's a validation right there and can help you as the educator to readjust and see what is it that we need to do differently to help that student. And I think from that, you are prioritizing um, taking care of yourself as an adult, prioritizing wellness, and making sure to reach out for supports. I know as educators, we're so good at trying to take care of it ourselves, and we're responsible for our classroom, all of our students. Um, but you don't have to be fully responsible in that you need to reach out and ask folks for help and ask for their perspective and ask for their support along the way. So that supportive database feedback. So if you do ask for support, or you are somebody, a teacher comes to you and you're a fellow educator and they say, hey, can you come in and observe my classroom and see how I'm implementing this intervention? It's really important that you start with positive praise right away. What is it that you see that's working right away? And pair that then with if there's some things that could be improved upon. Students respond the same way with that. Let's start with what's working. Let's praise them with what skill they've got. And then that keeps them at the table to keep listening. Okay, if there's something else that I can improve on. Adults are no different in that regard. So we respond just the same way. And we do want to celebrate when there is implementation success. We do need to celebrate that, and it's important to do so. So let's then get into, you've talked about as an educator, how we're implementing with fidelity and making sure that what evidence-based practices have been selected, that we are implementing as they're intended. But then we also need to look at data to determine, is it even having an impact on the student? So let's say we are implementing it with fidelity, but we'd also need to see, does it make a difference with the student? So there's that other piece of the data that are so critically important, which is the fourth step overall in this process. So we've got to know what is it that we're wanting to improve. So that operationally defined student outcomes, we're talking about what is the behavior that we want to improve. Sometimes we get stuck on, well, we don't want them to shout out all the time. Well, what is it that we want them to improve on? Well, maybe we want them to raise their hand more often. Maybe we want them to engage in the in-class discussions. So we've got to think about that, clearly define it, so that if we did ask for somebody to come in and assist and provide some support on the data collection piece, or even just the validation on what they're observing, that they know what they're also looking for. I think it's also important too, that helps us with our conversations with the families. It helps us with the conversations with the administrator and the other teachers across campus, so that we can give direct feedback based upon that data of, this is what we were working on improving, and this is what we saw, and this is how the student is doing in that regard. And that will help them start looking for that behavior and these new skills that the student's developing as well. So we've got to think about, based upon what you want to improve, you've got to figure out what your data collection strategy is going to be. So do you count the number of times that the behavior occurs? Do you look at the length of time that the behavior occurs from a beginning to an end? Do you randomly go in and do some time sampling on it? Or are there other methods where sometimes we're looking at rating scales, or we're looking at ABC, such as what happened immediately before the behavior, and then what kinds of things, consequences occurred right after the behavior, which tend to help support and maintain that behavior from occurring. And from all of that, when we've got data, then we want to look at and disaggregate it and determine, are these data any different than the rest of the students across my classroom here? Because again, when we're looking under a microscope, we do find things. It's just the nature of the beast, the way it is. But sometimes when we're looking under that microscope, we forget to look up and look across the classroom and to see, you know what, there are other students engaging in this same type of behavior as well. So the question is this just an isolated incident of the student, or is it that we are wanting, have expectations on the student, but yet other students are also able to engage in that same behavior? So we've got to really make sure and look at, is it equitable across the board, and use that data to determine who's responding and how are we making these improvements overall, and are we being equitable in the collecting of the data, but our expectations for behavior across all of our students in the classroom. Because the thing to think about is that if many students are engaging in problem behavior, the common thing that we talk about, if it's many students, it's a systems issue. And I think for you in your classroom to think about, if many students are engaging in a certain behavior, you've got to think about it as a systems issue. So if many students are on task, look at it this way. That means it's a systems issue. You have adequately, appropriately taught them what the expectation was, what the routines are, and that's why they're on task. You gave them explicit instruction and they know what to do. That doesn't magically happen. So that's an example of celebrating those successes. But you also have to look at, if many students are off task and they're all talking and they're getting up out of seat, that is not an individual student issue. That's a systems issue within the classroom, and we need to go back and look at our tier 1 procedures, go back and look at what we need to do to reteach our expectations. What do we need to do to reteach what the procedures are within the classroom, and acknowledge students that are starting to engage in the expected behaviors. We've got to think about, implementing neutralizing routines, and the more that we can communicate what the expectations are, communicate ahead of time what the procedures are going to be, it helps to offset any type of potential for problem behavior. Doesn't offset all of it, but it helps to just let everybody know what's happening across the board. I think the other thing too to think about is looking at overall at student data is you want to differentiate the implementation needs of all students. So are you including students with disabilities, and everybody's learning at different levels, and are we providing the support so that they can be successful? But overall, you've got to think, we've got to have access and a foundation of tier 1 within our classroom for all, and support all of the students. But then from there, determine, are more students needing additional support? If we are implementing tier 1 within our classroom, we're still having overall some classroom issues, and there's a few students that are engaging in more problematic behavior, we do want to go in and dive deeper with our data. And that's where we might need to adjust further. And this is an opportunity as an educator. You want to reach out to some of the specialists within your school and say, hey, I need additional support here. My student's not responding well to what I'm engaging in within tier 1 within the classroom. Do you have some ideas and what we can do based upon the behavior we'd like to see, the problem behavior they are engaging in, and what we can do to best support them? I need help on what do I need to do to prevent the problem behavior? What type of skill do we need to teach them, and how should I respond differently to that student? And then if there are students that still need more intensive intervention after what you've put into place, or you're seeing that they have more chronic intensive needs, it's possible they'd also need tier 3 supports and more intensive supports. And that's definitely where you would start to connect with the specialists on your school campus. It's possible they need a functional behavioral assessment so that we can provide those supports and they can be successful within your classroom. So overall, just remember that everything that we've done and all the interventions that you have selected and have started to implement, you're wanting to make sure, are they making a difference? Are you implementing them as intended? Because essentially you want to know that the efforts you're putting into it, it's making a difference. If it's not making a difference, the beauty is when you're progress monitoring, you can change it and you can and try other things using your data. So I'm going to turn it over to Brandy, who's going to wrap us all up, talk about how you can engage in a self-assessment. And thanks, everyone.
All right. Well, thank you to Maria and Karen and Heather. That was so much amazing information. And again, this is why we started at the beginning to say, don't try and do all of this yourself, because I think each one of these little practices that we did the fast way could be its own training, its own opportunity to look at examples, non-examples, resources, and do a deep dive with practice. And in fact, that's what we often recommend folks do, is take each one of these practices and do a deep dive. But while I'm saying don't go it alone, again, we're going to end this with a self-assessment. So we do want individual educators to have a chance to look at these practices and think about what's going well, where do you have priorities that you really want to improve on a practice, and where are things, going well enough that you're not going to focus on that right now. I think for most of us, we're really hard on ourselves and we can identify all the things we're doing wrong, and we don't always identify our strengths. So I'm going to encourage you in this self-assessment to be kind of graceful with yourself and think about where your strengths are, and where you identify needs, limit your focus to a few of them. So if there are lots of places you want to improve, pick those that are your top priorities, because the next step of this self-assessment is to, again, think about kind of where your implementation is, where your priorities are, and then move into an action plan. So we want each of us to be thoughtful about what are 1 to 3 areas where we want to plan to see improvement. We want to operationally define or get to a specific set of action steps that we want to take. And then we want to think about holding ourselves, as I click ahead, holding ourselves accountable to what level of implementation supports we're going to provide, whether it's from ourselves, whether we're going to invite a peer to help us, whether we might ask for a mentor or coach's support. We're going to hold ourselves accountable with a date. And then we're going to provide some additional details. So as an example, if I wanted to work on my specific praise rates, I might set a specific goal for myself. And this is actually the example right up here. I might download the Be Positive app so I could track my praise rates. I wouldn't do it all day long every day, but I might choose 15 minutes where I'm going to self-monitor my praise rates. And then I might enter those data every day during those 15 minutes. And the Be Positive app graphs it for me, so it makes it easy. And then over time, I can look at my praise rates. If I'm doing well and hitting my goals, I might even raise my goal a little bit until it gets to the level that I'm seeing my students benefit. If I'm struggling, I might reach out and ask for support. So that's just a quick example of an action plan that I might implement for myself. So if you got excited about this work and you want to do a deeper dive with other classroom resources, there are a ton of resources on pbis.org. And I just wanted to orient you to where the classroom resources live, which is in the drop-down menu on topics. You'll see Classroom PBIS is the second option there to select. And when you go there, you can find this guide. It's one of those that's highlighted in the narrative. It's also in the bucket around publications. And there's another newer guide that we also wanted to just mention, which is a new guide on MTSS in the classroom. And it should look familiar after listening to this talk, because a lot of the practices are echoed there. But in this resource, we are a little bit more explicit about what Tier 2 and Tier 3 look like in the classroom, with a range of examples that are linked specifically to approaches for evidence-based Tier 2 and Tier 3 practice. So that's just one place where if you feel like you have Tier 1 down, you might want to go up the triangle a little bit, and there's a few more resources in that. And then there are a range of videos available for classroom. And I just wanted to highlight one that Maria and Kent did recently on equitable classroom acknowledgement. So just again, a wealth of resources, examples, things to work on by yourself, but especially to work on in the context of coaching and training and support. So I want to thank you all for making it to the end of this video on behalf of Karen and Heather and Maria. And we look forward to continuing to support you and staying in touch with you through the PBIS Center. Thank you.